Good morning. How you doing?
Not bad, not bad. Sporting a hat today.
Yeah, very, very sexy.
We'll go that far. It's functional. Um, Haircut day. Everyone knows it's haircut day when I wear a hat. So there we go. So today I'd like to talk about willpower.
Okay.
And the role that plays or doesn't play when people are making decisions or motivating themselves to do things that are difficult.
Okay.
I'd like to talk particularly about the challenges to willpower as well and touch on some of that, because I think people often think it's a mechanism you can switch on and off like a light switch. I can just turn it on. I can,
Yeah.
and we've got loads of expressions that support that as well, like man up or,
Yeah.
And we touched on this in the last conversation that we had about this, go do it, get and do it. And that,
Yeah.
I noticed even the government said that recently. I don't know whether you caught that, where the minister said about people struggling with like household bills rising, and they just said, "Well, just go out and work more hours."
No, I didn't. No, he didn't. Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Work harder. I only noticed it because Gary Neville, of all people, oddly, reposted it and just commented, "Disgusting."
Yeah. I mean, it's like, who was it who said let them eat more or give them more cake or something? I mean,
cake, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for God's sake, I mean, haven't
Just
we
go work
moved on
harder.
in life?
Just go and work harder. The bills are on the rise, but it's okay. You just work more hours.
Yeah.
And it'll be fine. So there is this, that's kind of, 10 years link, I guess, to willpower. But generally, it's a thing that we are conditioned to believe we can switch it on and off and break through things through willpower, sheer power of will. So
yeah, I think the other side of that, Chris, is that if there's also like a strong thread out there, particularly on social media, it's like if you can't seem to tap into your willpower, that somehow makes you like a weak and an unworthy person. And there's lots of negativity around, particularly on a lot of these motivational videos that are out on Facebook and YouTube. It's like, if you can't tap into your willpower, then somehow you're a lesser being. And I hate all that stuff. So I think it's
isn't it?
Yeah. It's demeaning, and it's like, so no, I think willpower is a great subject to talk about. And how would you define willpower? What is it that sort of defines willpower as part of the psyche?
Yeah, for me, I think it is that ability to overcome things, and it's that ability to stay on course, stay true to what your intentions are, I guess. But I see it as a renewable energy, so it depletes as the day progresses, depending on how difficult a day you've got or encounter. And I think your willpower just actually wanes. So you've got to kind of look after it and use it when it's necessary. It's not going to answer everything. It's not going to answer every motivational challenge that you come across.
Yeah.
But it's something that you need to understand and recognize as something in your toolkit, or that you can then tap into when you need to. But I think a lot of people have this sort of view of it as it's the be all and end all in motivation, and actually that's what's always going to get them through every scenario and every situation and get them to reach their goal. Since some of the stuff that we've just referenced around just get on and do it, or man up, and so for me it's a tool. It's something in your armory that you can use, but you need to understand when to use it, and you also need to protect it and preserve it, because it does deplete. And I think depending on, like I say, if you've had a tough day, your willpower will be lower as a consequence, and that will affect some of your decision making.
Well, I mean, if you've only got to look at things like New Year's resolutions, and when people try and give up, smoking, drinking, eating the wrong type of foods.
Yeah.
And willpower, it's scientifically proven that willpower is just completely ineffective when it comes to that. Now, as with all things, it's not 100%. There are people who've got incredible willpower, and it's like, but most of the time, from my experience, it's like it's having a big enough reason to do something is what gets you through. And I think a lot of people mistake willpower for actually having a higher, call it a purpose or a higher reason for being able to do something. So I give you, again, I know I talk a lot about my dad in these chats that we have, but he was a smoker and a drinker, not like alcoholic, but he was a big smoker. I mean, when you could afford to, you know, when cigarettes were like 5 bob. So for our younger audience, a bob is a shilling, and a shilling is worth about when we did the conversion to decimal, it was a shilling is 5 pence, right? So you used to be able to buy a packet of 20 cigarettes for about 25p. I don't know what they are now, but it's probably more like 25 quid. But my dad used to go through 4 packets a day, 80 cigarettes a day. And so I think I might have referenced this in the last conversation that he had his 3 heart attacks. And when he had his first heart attack, the doctor said to him, you either give up drinking and smoking or you'll die. And he did. He gave up. Now at exactly the same time, and I mean exactly the same time, my dad used to be a member of the golf club. There was another guy who was a member of the golf club, a guy called Brian, and he had a heart attack at exactly the same time, and they were virtually in the next door beds to each other in the same hospital. And this guy Brian had the same advice, you know, give up smoking, give up drinking. And anyway, after about a couple of weeks recovery, Dad went back to the golf club, and he was, you know, I can't remember, he was at the bar and having a lemonade or something. And this guy, Brian, was at the bar having a scotch and smoking a cigarette. Dad said, are you mad? And he goes, if I have to give up smoking and drinking, life's not worth living. And he dropped down dead a week later. And that is an absolute true story. And, you know, so I always just think my dad must have had incredible willpower to give up smoking and drinking at the same time. But actually what I came to understand as I did research into motivation and understood the role that willpower plays, as you were saying, what I came to see actually was what he had was a higher reason. And that's when you can start to see where willpower fits in. So you were talking about you've got to understand where willpower fits in. So how do you see that? When you think about motivation, what are the different types of tools, and where does willpower fit in?
Well, I think willpower is something that gets you over bumps, and can, you know, overcome challenges. But it's something that, like you say, it's not. You need a higher purpose or a higher motivation in order to continue on whatever the path is that you're choosing in whichever sort of facet of life. And I mean, there's been some fascinating studies done around willpower and the you know, how easily it's affected, you know, by things that we would kind of pass off as quite mundane tasks, but that are eroding our willpower. And I know, you know, I've referenced this before, I think, but there was a study done with students where they were asked to memorize numbers, sequence of numbers. And you had one group that was asked to memorize a four-digit sequence, and the other group was asked to memorize a 7-digit sequence. And what they had to do was they were in a room, given the numbers to memorize, and then they were taken to another room to then recall the numbers. And in transit, they were offered snacks. And some of those snacks were healthy and some of those snacks were unhealthy. And what they found was the groups that were tasked with memorizing the longer number, bearing in mind it's only 3 more digits, were 70% more likely to pick an unhealthy snack than the ones who were tasked with memorizing 4. 70%.
But what's the significance of that? I'm not
the
quite
significance
seeing the
is that memorizing, because it's like a test condition, affects your willpower, damages your willpower, dents it.
I see. So because it was a harder exercise to memorize the 7
their willpower was more depleted, and they were more likely. And that's why, you know, that's why we, you know, I'm sure people can relate to this. You know, when you get up first thing in the morning, and your intentions are good and you want to be healthy, you won't go to the bar, you know, the fridge and grab a Mars bar. But if you've had a bad day, and that Mars bar's in the fridge, you're more likely to take it.
Yeah.
And I guess it's that kind of mechanic, you know, depending on the day that you've had or depending on the tasks that you've encountered during that day, it will affect your willpower. That could be with drink, you know, anything. And so for me, it gets you over a bump in the road or an obstacle perhaps that you might not have anticipated, but it's not something that gets you to your end goal. And so your story about your dad and that you know, comparable story with the guy who was in the hospital with him, I can relate to that because my dad, when he was in his 40s, had a stroke.
Right.
And he'd been smoking since he was like 13.
Right.
And he was told, give up smoking or you'll die.
Okay.
And he'd try to give it up loads of times to no effect. You know, I remember as a kid hiding his tobacco and stuff, you know what I mean? You know, because he gave up. He was told that and he just stopped, much like your dad.
Yeah.
What happened though is some sort of, I don't know, probably 10 years later, maybe a bit more, he was encouraged to have a cigar at Christmas.
Yeah.
He had a cigar.
Yeah.
And in that 10-12 year period, he'd put on a load of weight because as soon as he stopped smoking, he started eating more because it's you know, all the things that go with smoking. And then that one cigar, he started smoking again. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can remember my dad saying that because obviously smoking is a lot less prevalent than it was back in the 70s when, which is when I'm talking, you know, the story of my dad happened. And so he had exactly the same thing. And I can remember him being tempted by a cigar. And he actually did go on to sort of go back to smoke cigars, but he was able to control it, but then he stopped again.
Yeah.
And he always used to say that he could have started smoking at any time. He just had the urge, and it was obviously a deep physical thing that you know, once he'd become addicted, it never really left. So again, there's this constant need to sort of motivate yourself to overcome these instincts or these, you know, physical drives that we have within our bodies, you know, to what they call them, pangs and yearnings, you know, those we have to have willpower to overcome those things. But it's if we've got a lot of those things that we're trying to overcome at the same time, then as you say, the willpower is going to get drained really quickly. So the book that I read around this, amongst other stuff, so there is actually a book, it's called Willpower, and the surname of the guy who wrote it is I think a German psychologist called Baumeister. And he went into all of this stuff, and he absolutely says this, that, you know, you can use willpower for short-term things. So for example, it's like you were talking about getting up in the morning. So you let's say you get to work, right? So you've already been up for a couple of hours or whatever it might be. So even in that space of time, because of the challenges of getting to work, you know, particularly if you've got a young family and you've got to do any commuting, you know, your willpower is already, that energy that you need for your willpower is already a little bit depleted. So it's like, what can you use the willpower for? So the willpower might just be strong enough to get you to read your to-do list for the day. And you're going to then need something more powerful to get you to actually start addressing the issues on your to-do list. So particularly if you've got some challenging things that you've got to do, maybe you've got to have a couple of conversations that are feeling difficult, you know, whether it's with members of your team or your boss or customers, whatever it might be, and you're thinking, oh, I just don't feel up for that. It's like, so if willpower isn't going to be strong enough to get you through that doorway of saying, okay, I'm going to make this call now because you're already depleted, what else can you pull on to get you to the point where you say, okay, I'm now going to do the difficult stuff, and you've got another tool? What's another tool in your bag that you can use?
Well, I for me, it's that wider sort of motivation and tapping into the purpose of things, what the end goal is. The irony is that one of the things that does deplete willpower rapidly is choosing long-term over short-term goals. The The other thing is resisting temptation, and obviously those go hand in hand. But for me, it's understanding what the purpose is and being able to tap into that and not rely on willpower for things that you perhaps don't need it for either. Because I think we do that. We approach things without considering what the objective is, or we do things, we go through the motions, or we get stuck into habits, and habits run very closely with this whole motivation thing.
Sure.
Sort of even touching on my dad, the habit was that. And then when he couldn't do that, the habit became putting food into his face. And he ballooned. And so and really what's interesting is that's actually an effective way of beating of repurposing that habit. Obviously not effective in a healthy way, but a lot of people sort of make the mistake of taking away temptation without looking at how they repurpose that temptation. So we have, and then it becomes automatic, because our brains are hardwired to make efficiencies for us and take away thinking. And I think about 40% of what we do is automatic every day.
Probably more than that, I think.
Probably. And so looking at things like my dad, those things that drain willpower. If you can repurpose the habitual side of that, you're saving your willpower, because you're just and a lot of people make that mistake of if it's alcohol or chocolate or whatever it might be the temptation that depletes willpower. They take all the chocolate and the alcohol out of the house, or they take it out of sight. And the problem is of course you can't take all of that out of the world. You're always going to come across it. There's going to be people that drink, there's going to be people that eat chocolate around you. And the key with that is repurposing what the action is, because obviously you've got to trigger an action, which is the habit, and then the reward aspect of it. And if you can repurpose the middle bit and say, well, actually every time I crave it, I'm going to take a bar of granola out of the cupboard or something like that. Over time that granola bar becomes the reward, and you've repurposed that habit. And that makes it you far more effective at overcoming whatever that temptation is, because you've repurposed it, and then it's not a constant drain on willpower.
But aren't you then just replacing one habit with another habit?
Well, you are, but it's a healthier habit, isn't it?
Okay.
So this is a habit that serves your purpose, not one that detracts from it.
Okay.
But that's you could be quite clever with it. There's a great book called The Power of Habit, and I think it's Charles Duhigg. And he talks about that, and he talks about keystone habits, which then have ripple effects with other things that we do. And if you can identify a keystone habit and change it, because we know that neural pathway is always there, waiting to be activated. Like your dad said about always fancied the urge, but overcame it. And so that's why we when we go on holiday and come back, we don't forget how to drive. Or but when we are on holiday, we might do things that are less automatic, because we're in a different environment. Like we might put a leg in a different leg in our trousers first.
So the other book that's I know hugely influential in this space is Atomic Habits. I don't know if you've come across that one. I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote it at the moment, but
no, I can't either.
It's sold me.
That's a bad habit.
Well, that was like waving my hands around. So what we're saying, Atomic Habits. And that's been hugely influential. And one of the things that he talks about in that book is like the words that we use in our head. So something, and I don't know whether this applies to you, but I hear it quite a lot, is people who say, I can't do anything before I've had my first cup of coffee.
Doesn't apply me, but
and it's like, well, why? And he really said, well, this is become a habit, and it's become a pattern of behavior, and it does absolutely feed into what you're just saying about, okay, well, what could you do differently? But I think if I remember correctly, what he says in Atomic Habits is it then becomes around the words that you use. It's like, and you have to question that. Well, why can't you do anything before you have your first cup of coffee? Because that's just a frame that you've created
for yourself.
And it's like, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the more you say it, the more it becomes true.
Yeah, it's reinforced.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and the more you say it, of course, it's reinforcing. It literally is building a neural pathway up here
that you can't.
That then becomes harder to break. So, in terms of willpower, when you've got these neural pathways that are created, there's no way that willpower is strong enough to actually break through those neural pathways.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's when you need this different strategy. So you're saying the strategy is purpose, and
it has to be, doesn't it?
Reason. So
it has to be.
How? Let's say I don't have a habit of getting up and having a coffee first thing. But let's say I did. And there's some people who take it even further. It's like, I can't do anything until I've had 2 cups of coffee. And then they have that when they wake up, and then they get to the office, and the first thing they do is go and put the coffee maker on. So what would a purpose look like in terms of trying to break that type of habit?
That's an interesting one, actually, because that's tapping into habits, isn't it? And
but what we're talking about here is the willpower to break a habit, or
willpower to break a habit. I think
sorry, I'm wrong there. Not the willpower to break habit.
I was going to say, the strategy.
The strategy of using a higher purpose, a higher meaning, to break a deeply enrooted habit. Because if you can work that strategy out for doing something like that, you can then use it for these other things that we don't like doing. Like, I've got to have a difficult conversation with a client. I've got to have a difficult conversation with a supplier. Once you've got the strategy and the tool, you can then apply it in different aspects of life. So
for me, it's as simple as working out what good looks like, and then backtracking all the things, all the building blocks that support that, what good looks like. And if there's a place for that, understanding, like you said, challenging, why do I do that? Actually, what does that stop me from doing? What could I be doing instead of that? What could make me more productive, more focused on that purpose, and move to it quicker, or more succinctly almost. And I think we don't often spend time doing that. I mean, we know that people don't, businesses don't, individuals don't. We don't sit there and go, right, what are our goals? How am I in line, with achieving those goals? What do I need to do? What do I need to change? What's my path looking like now? And what does it need to look like to get me to those goals?
Sure.
We kind of plod in certain areas and argue for our limitations in certain areas, because we don't invest the time in doing that and actually creating a clear path and a clear strategy for achieving those goals. And we do, and a goal might be something lofty and ambitious and massive, or it could be something very small, but you still need to put the same amount of effort in. And I think what we do is we do fall back and go, well, I'll just, I'm going to have temptation over the next couple of days, but I'll get through that with willpower, and then I've conquered it. And we don't recognize that a lot of these pathways are permanent, and they're just ready to be reactivated again at the slightest dip. You miss the bus for work or whatever, and you have a bad start to the day, a bad journey. First thing you're going to do when you come in is reach for that cup of coffee. To compensate, because your willpower's gone. And so when you're relying on that, it's not going to take you where you need to go. You need to have a longer term strategy, which is around understanding what that purpose is and what good looks like in terms of how you want to reach that purpose, and how you want to achieve it.
So I agree with that. And I think it's absolutely essential what you've laid out. But I think there's an element missing, to be honest. And that is, there's lots of research out there which says we're more motivated by the avoidance of pain than we are by the attraction of gain. So, you know,
Yeah.
you were talking about, well, let's map out, look, what gain looks like, you know, what good looks like, you know, what is it we want to achieve? And, you know, and that's the classic rah, rah motivation sort of front. But actually what psychology and psychological science tells us is actually we're much more motivated to move away from pain and the things that are going to be detrimental to us. So we need to have both of those things. And
it's operant conditioning, isn't it?
Well, it's part of that. That's part of it, but this is like a deeply rooted thing. So the guy who really looked into this was Daniel Kahneman. He won the Nobel Prize because he created this science called behavioral economics, which is a mixture of economics and psychology. And he ended up publishing his books, his work in a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And what he lays out is all these thinking biases that are deep rooted within most of us. And the biggest one that he discovered was this idea that we're very bad at actually defining what good and bad looks like for various reasons. And one of the things that really underpinned his work was this idea that when it comes to making decisions, we will tend to make decisions which minimize our losses more than maximize our gains. Because we're frightened of losing. So and I think when we then get into thinking about this in depth, you know, whether it's about, okay, we're focusing on giving up like smoking, drinking, coffee, whatever it might be, but it equally applies to other habits, you know. But let's just stick with what we've been talking about. So let's keep with coffee, right? What are the potential losses that you might have if you give up coffee? So one that comes to my mind, particularly at work, is having that coffee break time at the coffee machine, you know, when you sort of get to gossip and slag off your boss or whatever it is you do, you know, and all that sort of stuff. You know, that's rooted around having a coffee together, you know. Very often, if you want to meet with a client, you'll say, hey, let's have a coffee, you know. So if you take that out of the mix, it's like, hang on a minute, my potential losses here are going to be huge. So we have to sort of take that into account. And I think this then feeds back into one of the tools that you were talking about, which is, okay, what are you going to replace that with? So it's like, okay, we can still use let's meet for a coffee, but when I get to the coffee shop, I'm going to ask for a mint tea, or I'm going to ask for a lemon and ginger tea or something. And then of course you're into that whole judgment thing. What do you mean? Why aren't you drinking coffee anymore? And then you've got to have, and that's when you've got to have your big purpose. It's like, well, I've decided to give up coffee for this, and this reason. And that's when you need it. You know, it's like, we are called to justify our actions and behaviors at times. You know, why have you given up drinking? I mean, how many people give up? You know, they do a dry January, right? So dry January is great for a lot of people, and I know it works for a lot of people. But there's a lot of people get about a week, 10 days in, and then they have someone's birthday. Like my birthday's January the 8th, right? You know, it's like, so I don't even, you know, my daughter's birthday's in January. My brother's birthday's in January. I don't even contemplate doing a dry January. You know, in fact, because of other things like that, I don't even contemplate anything that's to do with diet until about March. Because then I know I'm free of those social pressures to actually conform and take part and all that sort of stuff. So I think taking these things into account as well is incredibly important when it comes to thinking about your motivations, your drives, and where willpower can take you, and when you then need something else.
It's that anticipation, isn't it? And I think that's where we fall down, because we anticipate some of that stuff, and we think, well, actually, my willpower will take me through that, and it's not enough. You know, that's the problem. You know, so when you're doing that, in terms of, you know, if you're contemplating it till March, you're anticipating, actually, I'm going to have the temptation and all the rest of it that goes with that is going to outweigh the willpower to get me through it. So I just, I kind of accept that.
Yeah.
And then it's not a temptation. Then you save your willpower for other things that are more important.
And there is a bit of that. I must admit, I hadn't thought about it consciously in that way, but I had thought about it in the terms of saying, well, because if you think about the run up to January, you've got Christmas.
Yeah.
So actually, I mean, it's not so much now that I'm not working in the corporate world, but when I was in the corporate world, you could pretty much say that Christmas would start back end of November in terms of parties, dinners, lunches, going out for drinks with people.
Yeah.
And, then you're into Christmas itself, then you're into New Year. And then I'm into the whole January thing, and it's like, that's a pretty intense 2 months.
Yeah.
And the concept of losing my sociability by not being able to join in with drinking and eating was just too much. So this is where I think it ties back to the fear of loss, the work that Daniel Kahneman did, because we have to understand what it is we fear losing. And this is where you then get a lot of fear-based marketing and messaging going on, which we see a lot of today as these principles have become more understood.
Yeah, it's a manipulation tactic, isn't it?
Yeah, we see it a lot in politics. We see it a lot in health campaigns, environmental campaigns, where they're really, really pushing the fear side. It's like, if you don't do this, this is the consequence. And, because what they know is psychologically people want to move away from that. And again, I think, so the other guy who did a lot of work in behavioral science was Daniel Ariely. So there's a lot of work that he's done that followed on from Kahneman. I think you've got to be called Daniel if you're going to work in the behavioral sciences space.
Yeah, helps.
So he was looking at how did they get, he was engaged, I can't remember where, somewhere in America or Canada, I can't remember exactly. But how could they stop people dropping litter, particularly outside fast food joints? So they tried, all sorts of positive, keep a lovely neighborhood clean and this and that and the other, and like nothing, it made no difference. And I think it was something like, for every one that the campaign that worked was something along the lines of, for every 10 boxes of fast food joint, 3 rats will come out at night, or something like that. It was something along those lines, and it had a massive effect on people's behaviors. So understanding your fear of loss and allying it to what you said earlier about what it is you want to gain, I think seems to be a good strategy.
I think it's a really fine line though in terms of getting that right, because I know, I mean, there's an interesting case study around schools where the school parents were often late picking up their kids from the school. So what the school did to try and encourage prompt arrival was they introduced a fine. And of course, what happened was more people were late because more people went, well, actually, that's a £15 fine, and that gives me more time to do this. So I'll write that £15 off. So
that was actually in Daniel Ariely's book.
And so that's what they do, and when we introduce sort of economics and financial gain or pain, that's something that we. And fining is an easy system that people they use in sport. They document a week's wages and all that sort of stuff. And of course, if that pain's not great enough, it's just going to have the opposite effect.
Well, the other thing that they talk about with that example is when you take something that is like, let's call it a moral obligation. So before the school introduced the fine, the parents felt a moral obligation to get there, and there were some parents who sort of, for whatever reasons, abused it, and obviously that put pressure on the school. But the minute the school put the fine on, it changed it from being a moral obligation to a financial transaction that
Absolutely.
people could get, that people then started progressing it, processing that in the logical thinking part of their brain rather than the emotional thinking part of their brain. And it completely changed things.
No, it changes. I mean, there's that other study, isn't there, with the guy with the sofa, getting the sofa off the lorry. Are you familiar with that one? And
oh, not that one. No.
let's say there's a guy who's trying to get a sofa off the lorry and he's on his own.
Right.
And he just asks passers-by, sorry, can you help me get this off the lorry? And they do. Right. Because it's the right thing to do. Yeah. And then what they did was they run it with him saying, look, if I give you a £5, will you help me get this off the lorry? And people were saying, well, no. Because they're then starting to equate logically, well, is that worth £5? I'm not going to do it. Yeah. And you get, there's an interesting study on professional services with accountants and lawyers who then start to view their time as money because they're billing by the hour. Yeah. And that translates into their personal life. So they tend to like pass on parties, family parties, because they don't recognize it's being worth their money. Wow. Their time. Wow. And they make decisions based on that. Well, that's 3 hours at a party. That's worth X. Is it worth that going to that party? Yeah. And it's completely skewed because it's outside of the working environment. So we do have to be careful with what levers we pull when we're creating that pain.
So absolutely. No, the example that came to my mind when you were describing that was I used to be a member of a networking group called BNI. I don't know if you're familiar with BNI. Yeah. And one of the things was about referrals. So I was in BNI. Sorry, Giver's Gain. That's right. So I was in BNI for a couple of years, and it did me really well, and I learned a lot from being part of it. And part of it, a big part of it, is giving referrals to people. So when I came out of it, I thought, well, yeah, let's try and take that and see if I can get people referring me. And I offered a referral commission, if you like. If you refer me and I get a piece of business, there'll be a commission for you. And the resistance I had to that was like incredible. It was like, no, I'll refer you if I think you're any good. I'll refer you if I think it's going to be good for my reputation. I'll refer you if I think, it's going to help me, build my profile. But it's like the minute you put money on it, it changes the way people think. And it's like, I stopped doing it and I've never done it since. It's like just not worth it. So yeah, I think that point you make is like absolutely right. You've got to get that balance between what it is that you're scared of, that you want to move away from, that you're fearful of, and what is it that you want to move towards, and get really, really clear on that. And it's got to be a level of purpose and a level of meaning for you that is going to be bigger than any possible barrier that could get in the way. So it's like, if you want to lose weight, you've got to have a meaning and a purpose that's greater than when you're at work and it's someone's birthday and they come around, when you get the cake for people's birthday at work, you've got to have something that's more important to you so that when that cake comes round, you can say no.
Yeah, well, I think Simon Sinek has covered that in his first book, and that purpose has got to be inspirational. It's got to be inspiring for you to tap into it. It can't be because I think he identified 6 main ways of manipulation. And businesses use this, and employers use this all the time. And you touched on one, which is fear is actually a manipulation tactic. Because it's tapping into that primal, and it is used by politicians. And that whole kind of every 36 seconds someone dies from a heart attack, or that's what they do. Yeah. And often that causes problems, particularly when politicians are competing for the same audience or same following, because they're both using fear tactics against each other. And the whole Brexit thing was
exactly
backfired because of that, because they were both trying to scare everyone into picking a side. People then didn't know what to do, really, and couldn't make sense of it because they got so absorbed in the fear of that. And so he identifies 6. One is price, which is short term, but then it's what happens is expectations always on the rise. So there's always a drive to do more and add more, so you're creating a rod for your own back. Promotion is another one, which is like short-term gain. But again, it's hard to recover because of the value of it. And, you know, I think it uses a stat around sort of General Motors that, you know, they got out of hand with that at some point, and they were recording a like $700 loss on every car they sold. At that point, because they just put so many, you know, they had to keep piling on these features and benefits. Fear's one, aspirations another, and it's, you know, that's kind of where that New Year's resolution sits. And then there's peer pressure, which we talked about, you know, where you've got, you know, when you say you go into a coffee shop for a meeting, and then there's, well, why aren't you having a coffee? Why are you having this sort of lemon tea or whatever? And then there's this whole novelty thing as well, which is, you know, which often masked as like innovation. It's an innovative new way of doing something or whatever. And he had this great stat about Colgate, which since the 70s, they've got like 30 different types of toothpaste. And it's all novelty. And actually, they've got to a point where they've introduced a link to help you decide what toothpaste you need to choose. And it's crazy. And shampoo, you know, companies do it, and all sorts of companies do it. You know, they have different things that they add, which are novelty masters innovation. And what his point was in that book, which is quite valid, is all of those manipulation tactics are just transactional. They're just transactional behavior. But if you don't have something higher than that, then eventually that is you're gonna fall foul. And so, you know, this is why it's so important to understand why you're doing something and what that purpose is. And when you're in a business, you've got to communicate that effectively so everyone can understand that and get on board with it and be part of it. Because otherwise you're just reduced to those transactional behaviors trying to change people's perception. They're relying on their willpower to get through stuff. Performance drops. You know, if you're working in something that you feel disengaged, that's affecting your willpower. You know, if you're suppressing frustration and anger and things like that at your situation, then that's going to affect your willpower. And it's all of that, you know, dents your performance, dents your enjoyment, and then has a knock-on effect in your outside world, you know, when you're going home.
Well, all of those things you talked about are real drains on your energy, your physical and mental energy, and I think that's the point for anyone, you know, watching this. It's like your willpower is inextricably linked to the level of your mental and physical energy. And when your mental and physical energy is low, your willpower will be low, and it's incredibly difficult to force your willpower or leverage your willpower to do something if your mental and physical energy is low. So it's like, okay, in those moments, what else are you going to pull on? And that's when you need your purpose, your why, and you got to think that through. You've got to actually take time out, and it's got to be something that you really want. But also linked to that, it's got to be something that you really don't want, and you really want to move away from that. And you've got to find that, and you've got to be prepared to go there as well. And so many people aren't really willing to go there because it's like, oh, that's just too difficult.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I always, you know, with willpower, the role of willpower, I always see it as I've got a terrible sense of direction, absolute shocking sense of direction. And so whenever I go anywhere, I rely on sat nav, like wholeheartedly rely on sat nav to get me where I need to go. And that's walking, driving, whatever. Obviously, I've got it in the car. But when I'm out with my phone, I need that sat nav if I've gone somewhere that I'm not familiar with. And then I'm going to need the power in my phone, the battery, to get me back. And I see willpower as a similar thing. It's like, you know, yes, you need enough energy in the tank to get going, but you also need enough energy in the tank to get back and get through the end of get to the end of the day without having undone the good stuff that you've done earlier on in it.
Sure.
And so that's how I see it. So it's something that you've got to preserve, and if you're not in tune with that purpose, you're not going to preserve that energy because you're going to be relying on it when you shouldn't be.
So I was, before we started this call, I was on a call with a client, and they said something which I'd not come across before, and you may have done. and the phrase well, it wasn't a phrase, it was an acronym, and it was JFDI. Do you know JFDI?
Yeah.
You do.
You said,
I didn't.
Yeah.
So it's like, for those who don't know, you may know the Nike saying that they've had for a long time, which is just do it.
Yeah.
Well, the F, let's say that is a word that emphasizes that whole thing, which we can't say. But, you know, there aren't many F words that you're not allowed to say, so you can join the dots, right? Yeah. JFDI. Now, I know that there's a lot of people who just say, well, when you've got something difficult to do,
just do it.
JFDI, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, and of course, there are some people who can do that. I was sort of talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
But there are way more people who can't. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think this conversation is for all of those people who can't just JFDI, right?
Yeah.
For whatever reason. And it's like, don't feel bad about yourself. Don't watch these blinking motivational videos on YouTube or Facebook where it's going, get up at 5 a.m, get on the beach, lift those weights, you know, all that sort of stuff. You know, if you can't do that, you know. Yeah, that's one way of doing it. And if it works for you, do it. By all means, do it if it works for you. But for all those people who don't, find your purpose, find that bigger meaning. Yeah.
It's interesting, actually, because you just triggered when you was talking about people who can't do that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was always told as a kid by my parents is there's no such word as can't. And I was told that all the time. No such word as can't. And that's obviously reinforcing that, well, you've got to man up, find a way, deal with it, get on with it, JFDI it.
Yeah.
And you know, there's a lot of our language and our sayings that reinforce this sort of notion that, you know, where there's a will, there's a way, all that stuff.
But that's just not true. So
it's a myth.
You know, it's a myth, right? And there are some things you just can't do. So like, I'm 5'10", and I've been 5'10" all my adult life, and I've never been able to run, right? Now I could train from now until, all right, like even in like from a teenager, right? If I'd started training and really working out and doing everything, I still could not have run as fast as Usain Bolt or any of those sprinters, right? I couldn't run as far and as fast as Mo Farah and the marathons and all the things and those long distance. I'm not built to be a runner, right? And I really tried, because I love football and I wanted to play, but I couldn't, you know. And it's like, I did the training and I did, but every time I went and played outfield, I didn't have the stamina. And my legs went into cramps, and it just didn't happen. I became a goalkeeper, right? And I discovered my perfect running distance. 5 yards. Now the reason it was is because, like, over 5 yards, I was like really fast. So as a goalkeeper, like when I saw a threat, bang, I could get there, right? So I can't run like, you know, Usain Bolt. You know, I can't swim like Michael, what's his name? You know,
that's his name, but
you know, so there are things that you can't do, and it's pointless to say there's no such thing as can't, because it's not true, and it's not helpful. And actually, what it does, when you sort of have that mentality, there's no such thing as can't, it's like your brain goes, well, that's not true, because I can't do this, and therefore and then it projects like into the future, like you were saying earlier. So accept there's things you can't do, but find the things you can do
and enjoy them
and want to do. And once you found that, then there's no reason, then there's no can't. Right. Once you found the area that you want, and that's when you want to be able to access your willpower and motivation to take you on the path of what you can do and not what you can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
Brilliant.